It's been a frustrating season, I know, but Kevin Stefanski does not have to go. That and all the Cleveland Browns talk you need coming up on the latest episode of the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your new host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering the Cleveland Browns for you each and every single day here in the land. The overtures for Kevin Stefanski seem to be gaining more and more momentum of late, but I'm not there yet. I'll explain. The Browns have a lot of questions to answer this offseason, as we know. I'll give you one position, wide receiver, that is not on that list. They have answers there, and it doesn't much matter who starts at quarterback this week for the Browns, or really moving forward these last couple weeks of the season. But at this point, Dorian Thompson-Robinson probably deserves some reps. As always, I want to thank you for making Locked On Browns your first listen every day. And of course, we're part of the Locked On Browns network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. We get right into it here on our second episode together. Very much excited to be here with you. And guys, I understand, like, in a 3-11 season, people want heads to roll. People expect a price or a toll to be paid for the absolute failures of a season that had such high expectations. And that's maybe the biggest part of this conversation, is the idea that it's mind-blowing that a season for the Cleveland Browns that started with conversations revolving around the playoffs and making it back to the postseason after last year's run to the playoffs, that was just this kind of magical experience for everybody. Joe Flacco takes over late in the year, leads the charge, wins a bunch of games for you in December and gets you there, and everyone was re-energized and feeling good about this franchise. And it was supposed to sort of culminate in this year being the year that those things continued. It came together even more. And we were talking about Super Bowl runs at the beginning of the year. Let's just face it. Let's call a spade a spade. We thought this team had the talent to do that and to potentially get there if Deshaun Watson could return to some version of the player that he used to be. We thought that and the Browns certainly felt that was going to be the case, because that's part of the reason why they paid him all the money and made the trade in the first place. And that hasn't come to fruition. And so the calls for XYZ to be fired, and that always tends to start with the head coach. That's always the first thing fans are going to point at and say, get a new head coach, bring somebody else in here. They are valid and they are warranted, and I understand where all that comes from. I'm just not there with moving on from Kevin Stefanski at this point. And people might call me crazy. They might think it's ridiculous to not be there at this point with Kevin Stefanski. And I do think, like, even a couple weeks ago, I don't think that the overtures to fire Kevin were as loud as they seem to be now. And maybe it's just the effects of a loss to the Steelers, where the offense looked sort of lifeless throughout much of that game. A loss now to the Chiefs, where the Chiefs didn't play overly impressive. They gave you just like an okay effort, and that's kind of been the story of their season. And with all the one possession games that they played, you couldn't keep it within one possession. It looked like they dominated you on the scoreboard, even though that game was pretty close through the fourth quarter, late into the fourth quarter, and 6 turnovers are the reason why you lose. I think that there's just kind of this apathy that is set back in, and there's not a lot of for fans to be excited about at the moment. And so I think that has now transpired, and the chorus of people jumping in and saying fire Kevin Stefanski getting louder and louder at this point. I understand it. I do. But I think largely Kevin Stefanski is more likely to be part of the solution than the problem for this team. And I get it. Like, I'll say this, like, I have more questions or doubts, I guess, about his ability to take this franchise to the places we thought he was going to take it, back in 2020 when he led when he led them to the playoffs for the first time in 18 years. It felt like they had finally turned that corner. They had finally identified their head coach. And now questions are starting to set back in. And given the albatross that is the Deshaun Watson contract, this offseason and future off seasons are going to be really tough to navigate for both him and Andrew Berry. So maybe blowing it up is going to ultimately be the only option for this organization, even as soon as a year from now. That could be the case. And if it happens, I'll be there with you saying, yeah, it's time for some change. I just think I think Kevin Stefanski deserves a little bit more time to see if he can figure this thing out with a quarterback, maybe with a quarterback that finally he gets some say in, or that fits more of what he wants to do. Because from the start, and this is the biggest question I've had, I don't know why this organization decided to pair Stefanski with Deshaun Watson. And I know that they sit there. Andrew Berry told us during his bye week press conference that it's a group effort. It's been a continued group effort in the Deshaun Watson discussion and the Deshaun Watson decision-making process and everything that went into that. And that's fine. They can sell it to the fans and make it known however they want that everybody sort of had a hand in this. But there are some undertones that this was something that came down from the higher ups and the powers that be, that was almost sort of forced onto them because they wanted to upgrade the position. And so I can't fully blame Kevin Stefanski if this wasn't like his decision outwardly or his choice of a quarterback, and he was just trying to do the best he could to make it work. We've seen him make this offense function, make this team have success with lesser quarterbacks than what Deshaun Watson was brought in to be. So I've questioned that from the start. I think he does deserve more time, and that might only end up being a year, because again, a year from now, this thing might just be so off the rails they could have another bad year, and the only option might be moving on from your head coach, and likely the GM and Andrew Berry too, which in this equation, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the Berry discussion part of this, because I think I can save that for another day, but I do think there's a discussion to be had there as well. And that's probably the one that I'm less confident in. Like, I'm less confident right now in Andrew Berry's ability to maybe identify the players and evaluate the players that this team needs to get younger, to start sort of rebuilding this roster in make it sort of like a youth movement. I don't want to say it is a youth movement because, again, they're not stripping it down to the studs and starting all over. But they have to identify talent, maybe even at the quarterback position coming out of college. And I think Andrew Berry's had some shortcomings in the draft throughout his tenure so far. But it sounds like everyone's coming back and they're going to keep things status quo. For the Stefanski front, I think that's okay. Like, I do believe he's more part of the solution than the problem for this team moving forward, because we've seen him do it. And we've seen this team have success under him. And I think he's been sort of handcuffed in some ways by decisions that were over his head, or just things in roster moves that haven't worked out. And he's been sort of stuck with a roster and a quarterback situation that were just never going to work for him in this season. And I understand, like, we can look back and say this is similar to last year's low roster. What do you mean? The roster is kind of limited and kept him from having success this year. There's some truth in that. I think maybe we overestimated some of the players on this team at certain positions. The offensive line seemed to regress this year, for example. I think the defense, we still had high expectations for, because that group stayed largely the same. And that's, I think just kind of a natural regression that happens with defense. I'm not firing Jim Schwartz or anything. But yeah, like that's an area where there are still some concerns. But I'm anticipating they can bounce back next year, especially with Myles Garrett and some others, the Denzel Ward at the forefront. But yeah, I think maybe this team was not as talented this year as we thought they were going to be. And I'll also say this, for an organization that for years, better part of 2 decades, we spent questioning their ability to identify the right head coach and the right quarterback. I mean, how many quarterbacks have gone through the halls out there in Berea as they tried to sort through that problem? They still haven't gotten that right. They finally seem to have gotten the head coach at least somewhat right, given the success that he's had. 2-time coach of the year, gotten the team to the playoffs 2 times. You expect this organization, if you're on the Kevin Stefanski bandwagon, you really expect this organization, an organization that has notoriously missed missed the mark at those two roles in particular. To get both of those things right in the same offseason, like if they fire Kevin Stefanski and they need to go try to identify a quarterback for the future and Stefanski, you think they're going to nail both of those in the same offseason when they haven't been able to really identify both at the same time for the better part of 2 decades? It's a very, very difficult needle to thread for an organization that I don't know has the credibility to say that they can do those things and that they can actually find those two things at the same time. So I'm willing to lean into the idea that keeping Kevin Stefanski around provides some stability for the organization, at least for the short-term future, and let the chips kind of fall where they may next year. And again, the conversation might change, but I'm not there right now. Up next, one thing the Browns don't have to worry about finding this offseason in an offseason that's going to be filled with plenty of questions. Wide receiver 1. That and more coming your way next on the Locked On Browns podcast. Last month, I had a chance to go to my first ever Ohio State-Michigan game with my wife. It was a great time. We had an absolute blast, at least until the game itself was over and the Buckeyes lost their 4th straight to the Wolverines. What could have done without that experience, but the disappointing results aside, I don't regret my ticket buying experience using Gametime. Gametime is focused on togetherness this holiday season. That means when you bring people together at live events, the experience is that much better. And it makes for the perfect gift. I'll tell you, my ticket buying experience went so smoothly with Gametime this year that Gametime has now become my go-to app for buying tickets. Plus, they have a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for live events even easier than before, including panoramic views of your seats. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Every Sunday before the games get rolling, I sit down and I open up the FanDuel app and scour through all the available bets for the day. I'm a big first touchdown guy. So like this past weekend, I threw some money at Travis Kelce to be the first touchdown scorer against his hometown team in the Cleveland Browns, the team he grew up watching. That one didn't actually come to fruition. So bad advice by me on that one, but that's okay because there's plenty of opportunities to get some money back, win some money back. You win some, you lose some. It's all part of the experience, but get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers can bet $5, get $150 in bonus bets if you win that $5 bet. It's that simple. In the FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live, play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook sponsor of the NFL. Back at it with you on the Locked On Browns podcast. And guys, I know that the Browns have a ton of questions to answer this offseason. It's going to be problematic. It's going to be a tough thing to navigate for Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski and company, as we sort of alluded to earlier in the show. But I'll tell you this, one area that they do not have to worry about addressing is the wide receiver position, because I believe in my heart of hearts that this organization has identified a true #1 wide receiver. I understand they had one at the beginning of the year in Amari Cooper, and obviously they wound up trading him earlier this season to the Buffalo Bills. And it's, it wasn't the way we saw that sort of situation playing out. Amari Cooper was an adored player here in Cleveland. But Jerry Jeudy has stepped in and filled that void so beautifully for this team. And it's not a coincidence that when the quarterback change happened, and I do think that Jeudy had some success with Deshaun. I think we saw that in training camp. I think we realized that they had some chemistry on the field. It was the one guy it seemed like Deshaun Watson seemed to have success with in the passing game. But when the quarterback change happened and Jameis Winston took over, I mean, Jerry Jeudy just took off to another level, starting with that Baltimore game where he had 79 yards receiving on 5 catches, and it's gotten better and better ever since. He has basically gone every week since, with his highest reception totals in his last 5 games, dating back to the performance in New Orleans where he went for 142 yards and had an 89-yard touchdown catch. He basically he's put together 3 100-plus yard performances, including this past weekend against Kansas City. He has scored 3 of his 4 touchdowns over that span as well. So he's been brilliant. And I do believe that as the Browns kind of navigate the offseason and they look for weapons to provide whatever quarterback is going to be here next year, I don't think they have to stress or be overly stressed about finding a number 1 wide receiver for the team to sort of build around, or going and swinging big for somebody, or even maybe using that first round draft pick on a wide receiver. I think that's kind of the key component here, because with a team with so many needs and quarterback being chief among them, as we know, they can probably use that first round pick on something else. And I expect as we get deeper into the season, as the offseason progresses, we can talk more and more about what we think the Browns should use that pick on. I will certainly talk about that. I know you'll have some opinions on what direction the Browns should go with that first round pick that they're going to have, which is likely to be a top 10 pick as well. And so there's a chance to identify some really good talent there. And yeah, that could be a wide receiver, but I think they have other needs that they can sort of focus on. And there's a comfort that's come with the ability to maybe think about going a different route. No pun intended, because we're talking about the wide receiver position. But Jerry Jeudy's kind of provided that comfort because he's been so good over the last 8 weeks or so, and made Browns fans feel like, yeah, you lost Amari Cooper, but this guy's kind of stepping in and taking the reins. So what does that mean in terms of like a checklist of needs for the Browns? Well, I think first and foremost, it allows Cleveland, like I said, to focus on maybe something else in the draft and in free agency. I also think it just means, like, instead of, again, going big fish hunting, feeling like you have to go get that star wide receiver, or identify a star wide receiver, or like you're missing that number 1 guy, which has been part of the conversation with this team for several years, I think. Obviously, the Amari Cooper trade several years ago made you feel good about having a number 1, but there were still questions each offseason, like, do they need to find their new number 1? We know there were some trade rumors involving Amari Cooper leading up to the season that would have seen him get swapped for like Brandon Ayuk, who probably would have assumed that role as well, or him or Jerry Jeudy would have sort of complemented each other. But I think the key thing here is just that instead of having to worry about just finding a number 1 wide receiver, the Browns have that already in Jerry Jeudy and what he's been able to do. And they can now just kind of focus on somebody who complements Jerry as a number 2 guy. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like necessarily, but it because they have so many things to address, so many needs on this roster, it's nice to know that at least one thing is kind of taken care of in that way. Like you don't have to necessarily stress over that position. And yeah, it's just kind of about like filling in the cracks and finding some complementary pieces. I think Cedric Tillman has kind of proven with Jameis Winston under center that he can sort of serve in a complementary role, but more so as like a number 3 wide receiver. So it's kind of finding that number 2 guy. I don't think it's Elijah Moore, even though Elijah Moore has had some more success of his own, seen an uptick in his numbers. Same thing since Jameis Winston assumed the starting quarterback position. And yeah, like there's a lot of encouraging signs there. But to me, like I have no doubts at this point that Jerry Jeudy is a number one wide receiver. I think it's great that he's thrived here and really proven a lot of doubters wrong, because when he was traded for, and even it was less about the trade because the Browns gave up like it was 2 like day 3 picks. But when they traded for him and then signed him to the extension, I think that was the thing that really caught people's attention, Browns fans included, and had some wondering, including national pundits, okay, why would they do this with a guy who hasn't really proven anything? And they kind of bet on him thriving and turning his career around. And in year one, he has done that in spades. 1,052 yards, first time in his career he's eclipsed 1,000 yards. That's a big point of contention for him because everyone started bringing up when the trade went down. He's never had 1,000-yard season in his career. Why would the Browns make this move? Why would they extend a guy who's never done this in his career? And so to see him go out and have that success, I know it meant a lot to him to sort of prove a lot of the doubters wrong and the people that didn't think that he could put up those numbers. So it's been an encouraging thing for him in that regard. He's also done that. He's one of only 5 wide receivers this year who has 1,000 yards receiving, and he's done it on like way less receptions than most of these other guys. Like Jamar Chase has 102 receptions. Justin Jefferson has 82 receptions. He's the next closest guy with 12 more than him. Like it's been a phenomenal couple of weeks here. And I think he has proven that, yeah, like those first couple of years, maybe it was just a situational thing. He's looked brilliant. And so I don't know how much comfort that provides you in a year where the Browns have a ton of questions, but it does feel like they at least have one position sort of taken care of, and they don't have to stress or put too much emphasis on finding a number one wide receiver. Because I think Jerry Jeudy's proven to you over the last several weeks, really since right before the bye week and since week 8, about midway point of the season, when Jameis Winston also took over the offense, that he can be that guy. We now know what Jerry Jeudy can be. He's been unlocked, and the needs that they have at that position more so revolve around finding players to complement Jerry and who sort of fit into secondary roles in this receiving core, a number 2 sort of complement guy. The one thing Jerry isn't is kind of like that big body wide receiver. So maybe there's something there where you need to go find somebody who can be that and sort of fill that void for Cleveland. But I feel confident in saying that Jerry Jeudy can be this team's number 1 wide receiver moving forward. And he's put on a show these last couple of weeks. So yeah, a lot of problems with this team that we certainly will be talking about throughout the offseason, and understandably so, and certainly plenty to think about in terms of needs that this team has. I don't think wide receiver is one of them, at least not wide receiver 1. They probably still need a wide receiver. That's still something they're going to have to address in the draft or in free agency. But I don't know that they need to go all in on trying to identify a number 1 guy, because I think they already have that. And that one is a tip of the cap to Andrew Berry for identifying Jerry Jeudy and believing he'd fit here. And he has done that, again, in spades. Up next, a quarterback change seems imminent. It doesn't much matter who starts at this point, but I guess it's time to see Dorian Thompson-Robinson. We'll talk about it coming up here on the Locked On Browns podcast. It's that time of the year. The college football playoff is officially back, and with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting, high-flying excitement that you love and I love. At TNT Sports, coverage of college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern. Leading to our first matchup, Southern Methodist University Mustangs taking on the Penn State Nittany Lions. That game kicks around noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. Back at it here on the Locked On Browns podcast, and it sure does sound like a quarterback change is imminent. I'm going to be honest, guys, just giving Kevin Stefanski's comments, because, again, a week ago, he was asked whether or not Jameis Winston was still a starting quarterback, And he made it very, very clear that Jameis was going to be the starter. This week, he couldn't commit to that after the game. He wouldn't commit to that on Monday in sort of his post-mortem press conference that he has, where he talks and breaks down what transpired the day before. So certainly feels like a change is coming, and it will likely be in the form of Dorian Thompson-Robinson, of course, assuming that starting position. I don't think it much matters. I've been on the record in previous weeks saying I don't know why I really need to see Dorian Thompson-Robinson, because I think at this point, guys, I feel like I know what Dorian Thompson-Robinson is. He's a 5th-round pick. He's always going to sort of. I think there's a viable backup quarterback in this league in Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I think that is very much true. I think the Browns, more importantly, understand and know what Dorian Thompson-Robinson is, and that's why I think it's been sort of this Jameis Winston, let him ride it out, let's see what he can do sort of thing, as the team has prioritized still trying to win football games, and that's been Kevin Stefanski's message throughout this stretch where we kind of knew that the playoffs weren't going to be a thing, and it's been that way for a while now, even since he really took over in week 8. Like, there was an outside chance they could make a run, but that kind of went out the window, even after the Chargers lost right before the bye week in week 10, that we kind of understood like where this team was at. But yeah, like in the name of winning, I understand why they kept Jameis Winston out there. And I honestly said, even as recently as last week, going into that Chiefs game, when people were sort of clamoring for, let's see what Dorian Thompson-Robinson can do, I asked the question, why? I didn't really understand it. I think I was more so still evaluating Jameis Winston and the viability of him being this team's, let's say, franchise, or not even franchise, bridge quarterback next season. I didn't need to see Dorian Thompson-Robinson in any capacity. I just didn't think necessarily that because again, I just think we know what he is. I don't necessarily think you're going to get some answer, or he's going to unlock something that proves that he is the some franchise quarterback for this team. Like, I just don't think that player is in there for a Browns team that drafted him kind of on a whim in the 5th round, hoping just to, I think, get a backup quarterback or some role-playing style quarterback. But all that said, at this point, I as much as I was still willing to sort of evaluate Jameis in the possibilities of him being a bridge quarterback for this team in 2025, which I still think is on the table, by the way, I also do feel that it might just be time to play Dorian Thompson-Robinson, because it might just be time for a change. I don't think it matters, regardless of who's under center for this team. Obviously, when the games don't matter, that's the case, and it's just sort of 3 games to get you to your offseason and all the questions that come with it. So yeah, like in the grand scheme of things, these games don't really matter anyway, other than just like playing for pride and whatnot. Now, obviously, the players are going to play hard, but in terms of an evaluation process, I don't know that Dorian Thompson-Robinson is going to show us anything that we don't already know. And I think the Browns kind of understand who he is, but from the standpoint of just like making a change because Jameis has just become too turnover prone. Like it's always in there, but I think like now we've seen enough. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make here is you have a quarterback in Jameis who, even as recently as last week, I might have been willing to still sort of trot out there and get a sense of whether or not he should be back next year. I think this Chiefs game was kind of the nail in the coffin for me. I think it sort of proved my point, my larger point on Jameis, that yeah, I understand he puts up the nearly 500-yard performances, and he's given that he breathed some life into an offense that was just completely inept and historically bad to open up the season. And he deserves credit for that, and he deserves credit for being sort of just the fun personality that he is, and bringing some joy to a season that has been a miserable one for you and other fans of this team. But in the same breath, like last week sort of, I think, summed it up for me. Every time it seemed like the offense had momentum, he'd throw an interception in the end zone. There was other turnovers. I'm not putting it all on him. Nick Chubb fumbled. There was the muff punt that led to a quick score for Kansas City. Like, there was other problems. He wasn't responsible for all 6 of the turnovers that the team had in that game. but to go no touchdowns, 3 interceptions, it sums up the Jameis Winston story. And so I think maybe that's why I'm okay making the change to DTR, even though I think I understand who he is at this point, even though I think the team understands who he is at this point, because I do think Jameis Winston now has just run his course. And I feel comfortable in saying I don't know that he should be the bridge guy. That doesn't mean he won't be, by the way, because I don't know what options this team has other than drafting a quarterback to bring in next year to sort of compete for that job that it sounds like even Deshaun Watson will have a chance to maybe earn back once he's back from his ruptured Achilles, and see what he can bring to the table in sort of some sort of competition. But I think we now, the jury is no longer out on Jameis. Like, when the games matter again next year in September, you're not going to want a guy who's going to cost you games by throwing too many interceptions and turning the ball over as much as he does. So yeah, I'm ready for Dorian Thompson-Robinson to sort of finish the year here, get in whatever evaluation we have to get in, even though I think it's sort of a useless conversation, because I don't necessarily think we're going to see something profound from DTR that makes us feel like he's the franchise quarterback for this team. But it's worth at least evaluating him, because I think I've now gotten what I needed to see, and I've learned what I needed to. If there was anything still to learn about Jameis Winston, and I guess there still maybe is room to learn a little bit more about Dorian Thompson-Robinson, so we'll see. But I in my heart of hearts, I don't really think the decision matters, because I don't know that either of these guys are like your should be your go-to option to start the season next year. Again, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I think the team probably will look into bringing back Jameis Winston in particular, and maybe even make him the starting quarterback to start the season, or some sort of bridge for this team. I think that's on the table. I just don't know how viable that's going to be for a fan base that's going to expect the team to win games next year. It's one thing when the games are of no consequence and you have a quarterback who makes things fun in a miserable season. But when the clock resets and those games matter again, I think Jameis is just he's too turnover prone. I think that whole thing has run its course. So sure, give me DTR, and we'll see how these last 3 games go. Another one in the books. Thanks for joining me and talking about your favorite football team, the Cleveland Browns. We may be talking about a quarterback change in the coming days even further, which I look forward to breaking down with you as always. And I appreciate you being an everydayer here on the Locked On Browns podcast. For your second listen, go find the new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, check out the Locked On Cavs and Locked On Guardians podcast. You can also find any Locked On content on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. I will talk to you again real soon, but for now, I'm out.